thank you all very, very much for sticking around for this final panel. I hope it's going to be entertaining as much as we've learned from the previous two panels. This one I hope will be what we might think of as a lightning round, and we will try to keep it moving quickly. We're going to have 3 minutes for ideas for each of the panelists, and I think this is an especially timely panel to do because the unique thing about high-tech policy, telecommunications policy in Washington is that it's an area where things actually happen once in a while. So you have to keep your eye on this ball in particular. And so I'm grateful for the quality of this panel, and I'm very eager to hear their ideas. I'm just going to let them take over in just a minute, but I want to introduce them quickly. I have, to my immediate left, William Lehr of MIT, Mark Jamison of the University of Florida, Tim Brennan of the University of Maryland, Scott Wallsten of Technology Policy Institute, and Michael Mandel, who you've heard from earlier today already, Progressive Policy Institute and other institutions, and Olga Ukhaneva of Georgetown. So why don't we start, is it Bill?
Sure.
Bill, with you. Why don't you give me your 3 minutes?
So I'll talk fast in an MIT tradition, really fast. So basically, I'm going to talk about doing stuff that I think is hopefully going to build for the future, because I think that's ultimately going to be a leap of faith. I think policy needs to target where we want to go, not where we've been, and too often the policy debates are where we've been. It's fundamentally a multidisciplinary question that involves not just economists, but needs to involve engineers and lawyers, and having those discussions is really, really hard. The vision that we're trying to get to is one of pervasive computing, and the real challenge over the next 20, 30 years, and that's what we try to craft policy for, is how to deal with real world and virtual world convergence. So that's always on, everywhere, everything connectable, that's Internet of Things, that's big data, that's AI robots, that's autonomous vehicles, that's augmented reality, it's smart X, it's all these things that if we get them, we're actually gonna have a lot of economic growth. And if you look at things like the FCC's broadband plan, half of it is chapters about how do we make education better, and they recognize that they're not the only ones that can do that. If we're going to do that, that implies a lot of wireless, and my policy recommendations all, in some sense, focus on that, because the single most healthy thing we could do is guarantee that we have a healthy wireless ecosystem. We have to imply, that means lots of wireless of all kinds, so shared spectrum, that's a single thing I would say. The other things are markets and not central planning. And to get markets to work, we need to have a good measurement ecosystem, and we may talk about that later. And that we also have to deal with the fact that we're living increasingly in a global market. In a global market, that means we need to figure out how we're going to manage that internationally. From the shared spectrum perspective, the single thing that we're trying to do is recognize that increasingly technologies allow us to commodify spectrum. We're moving to a world of small cells, fixed mobile, converged architecture, and shared infrastructure, where the infrastructure that will be shared is not just going to be the spectrum, it's the access to where the antennas are, it's the power, it's the devices. When the antennas are really small, the spectrum they use locally is small, and the systems are going to be really, really dynamic. What we need to really focus on is we really need to be serious about this question about commercial government sharing, and the policy things we really have to focus on is how do we get incentives for government users to recognize the opportunity courses of the resources they're using. And there's a lot of efforts to try and do that, but a lot more needs to be done. That means we have to clear barriers for novel government commercial sharing and ways in which they'll think about their IT infrastructure. And this is so important because as we embed the ICT technology increasingly in all aspects of our local lives, it means we're not going to have separate infrastructures for our public. Infrastructure is a public, in some sense, shared asset. So the conduit, the poles, the local buildings, all of these things are going to have to be part of it. We're going to have to make sure how the commercial and the private sectors work together. There's a bunch of stuff if you're in sort of spectrum space that we may get into, but obviously free a lot of that up.
Great. Mark.
What I would look at is disbanding the commission. Not the agency itself, but the commission. I think a commission is an idea whose time has passed. I think what we're seeing, not just at the FCC, that's our case in point, but as we look across other government institutions, we're seeing that they're not able to withstand the partisan politics, the pressure of partisan politics, and the pressure of cronyism. They're just not standing up to it and keeping it away from the analyses. So I would do away with the commission, go to a structure that removes the president's power to appoint who is on the commission, do that with a broader structure that has some business input and some political input as well, and also have requirements for who are the decision makers. Decision makers would have to include economists, accountants, lawyers, engineers. This is done in other parts of the world, and I think we could do it here as well and improve our decision making quite a bit.
Probably still got a minute left if you got anything.
No, that's okay.
You can share it with us. Yeah, take off the 7th floor in addition to the 8th.
Okay, thanks. We were literally sent an email in boldface saying we have 3 minutes. So while my 35-slide presentation is loading, that's a joke. I'll make 3 points. The first is I don't have any specific economic recommendations. I have no idea what the market failures might or might not be in the future, what might or might not be competitive, where there are network externalities, public goods, asymmetric information, and what the cost of regulation might be. So I'm just going to stay away from that rather than sounding like someone talking about the virtues of analog HDTV standards or AM stereo, or as we heard earlier today, focusing on wireline in the National Broadband Plan. The second thing, it occurred to me, well, maybe I could say something about Congress. One thing people have talked about, and I have some sympathy for it, they could clarify the reach of the FCC, an issue that's come up quite a bit. And even something smaller, they could limit merger, maybe they could pass a law limiting merger conditions to actual competitive problems in the mergers. However, I think recommending congressional action is operationally equivalent to recommending no action or opening a Pandora's box of God knows what you might get. So let me give the third thing, which is probably going to come as a surprise to some people. I think what we need is some sort of norms, theories, and evidentiary standards when the rationale for a telecommunications policy rests outside standard economics. I'm thinking of things where maybe firms are profit maximizers or so-called public interest standards that might sit outside economics. And I say that for 2 reasons. One is that without such phrasings, without such a framework, these things just become assertions. This is in the public interest. We not have universal service for this reason or that reason or whatever. And so one can't talk about it in a way that says, well, what's the evidence for this? Yes, but. And the other thing is that what we do now instead is that we force these considerations to be expressed in the framework of antitrust economics, and I think that doing so does both those considerations and antitrust economics a great disservice, and there's enormous amount of evidence for that in the last 5 years.
So I'm equally ignorant as Tim. So rather than specific proposals, I want to suggest something that's sort of generic and that I've said in the past, and since it'll never happen, I can keep saying it forever. And that's that we should build analysis directly into any programs or projects that the FCC or any other tech agency or anybody really proposes, so that way you can evaluate them to see whether they work or whether they don't. That's something that we never, ever do. We just try to evaluate projects ex post, and it's almost impossible. Part of that means doing pilot projects and then evaluating them, and then using those results. And that also involves a commitment on the part of people who may oppose the idea of the things that are being tested to not criticize failures, right? Because if you're going to try things, some of them aren't going to work. And I think an example of that are the pilot programs that the FCC did for Lifeline. I have a paper on that, and I'm presenting that at TPRC this weekend. You can come look at that. And the results of those pilots are really interesting in that the main thing was they couldn't get low-income people to sign up. So they weren't really able to test any of the other hypotheses that they proposed about, the effects of different prices and equipment subsidies and so on. But what we learned was that we don't know how to get low-income people to sign up. And that was actually a big, huge finding. We didn't know we didn't know. And so, of course, the FCC completely ignored all those pilot programs when it redid the Lifeline program. It shouldn't have. I mean, by some measures, people might have thought those pilots were a failure, but they weren't. They really revealed something we didn't know. So if we want to solve that problem, we should have looked at those results and maybe done some more to figure out what it was that we could do to get people in line, but we didn't. So that's what we do. So I want to suggest, in the words of Martin Cave, that we should move from policy-based evidence-making to evidence-based policy-making.
Policy-based. Do I have to repeat that over and over again?
Evidence-based, move from evidence-based policy-making.
Okay, I got it. Okay, terrific. 3 minutes, you say? I'll do what I can. The new administration is going to take office with a mandate to raise consumer living standards. What we want to do is we want to point them in the right direction. If you look at the data, and I separate out the economy into a digital sector and a physical sector. If you look at the data, it turns out the digital sector has been going great guns in terms of improving consumer welfare, and the physical sector has not. And by digital sector, I mean all the industries where the outputs are easily digitized. This includes telecom, broadcasting, entertainment, also includes finance, and a lot of the professional services, where we see tremendous growth over the last 15 years with rates of productivity growth at 2.7% a year, accounting for an enormous amount of the investment in information technology. About 70% of the investment in information technology is going into the digital sector, even though this is only about 25% of the economy. Meanwhile, the physical sector has grown much slower, with much higher rates of price increases, with productivity growth of only 0.7% a year. And even though the physical industries account for, say, 70% of the economy, they only account for 30% of the spending on information technology. So really what we're in a situation of a two-track economy where we sort of have to, a lot of the discussion here today has been about regulation of the digital sector, but in some deep sense, the digital sector is fine. The digital sector is growing with rising productivity. It's actually hiring at the same rate as the physical sector is. It's actually, the price increases are very, very low. The problem with this economy is the physical sector. This is another way of saying what Bill said, which is that we have to do whatever needs to be done to convince the physical sector to start investing in information technology, because that's the way that we're going to get the growth in productivity and also in jobs. What I worry about is that the fingers will end up getting pointed at the digital sector, which is demonstrably doing just fine. And if you want to hear about this, I'm going to flag my TPRC talk on Friday morning. There is, in fact, another paper coming right behind this, that one, which is an overtime paper that makes a broader set of points about the distinction between these two sectors and how to think about them.
All right. I think because Scott and I are colleagues and also co-authors, we are sort of thinking in the same direction. So I also would like to suggest or advocate for, just like we have evidence-based medicine, I think we should have evidence-based policymaking. It's extremely hard to design a good policy. You have to figure out which people you want to target, what are the unintended consequences and incentives of the policy, once somebody has to be accountable for the policy that we implement. We have to, see how, if it's efficient, there has to be some analysis of it. And if there's enough evidence that the policy is not efficient or, it doesn't have a lot of impact, people are misusing the funds, I think we should not hesitate to either modernize it or, if it's not possible, to get rid of it. And as an example, I'd like to also talk about Lifeline, because that's the program that I've done my research on. And as probably some of you know, by the order of 2016, Lifeline has been extended to broadband. So starting December 1st, customers will be eligible to get subsidy to subscribe for a broadband plan. And I think that's a very noble goal, and we should help low-income households to get broadband. However, Lifeline program is known for a bunch of problems, and my own research shows that it suffers from a lot of inframarginal subscribers, so people get subsidy because they can and not because they need it. And also, it has really high administrative costs. Some of my colleagues and I, we estimated how much it costs to provide $1 of Lifeline subsidy, and turned out it's cost 65 cents. And actually, companies pay for it, and they're not reimbursed by the FCC. So it raises some questions. Recently, with the help of Commissioner Pai, he found a bunch of loopholes that were there was a major overhaul of the subsidy in 2012, and it was supposed to get rid of those, frauds and abuses, and apparently we still have them. So my suggestion is that we really want to, before extending some of the policies to a broader set of services, for instance, we really have to think about what's the best way to do that. And if we have some evidence that some program doesn't work, so before doing it, we need to really maybe overhaul the program altogether and not just move forward because we have to.
All right, so I count Mark, Tim, Scott, and Olga as being concerned about the way the FCC makes its decisions. There are variations in terms of your reasoning, but I would say a strong thread that runs through many of your points is they do a lousy job of taking economics into consideration in their decisions. So how do you fix that problem in specific terms and try to limit it to 1 minute? And you can go in whatever. Mark, if you want to go first, that's fine.
Yeah, that's exactly what my proposal was essentially about, is how do we insulate analysis and the use of analysis from the political and the cronyism pressures. And like I said, as I look across more institutions than just the FCC, I think this is a growing problem. I don't think the way we've designed our institutions are capable of dealing with today's environment. So we have to redesign them. And for that, I would make the influence of a president to be able to have on who sits on these decision-making bodies, I would lessen that. So there's less of political tie. I would also have some professional requirements. This is done in other countries where you do have to have an economist, you do have to have a business person, you do have to have an accountant, you do have to have an engineer. And so these people have professional credentials, they have a professional they have professional peer relationships that they worry about. And they care about, am I pleasing the president or am I embarrassing myself in the decisions I'm making?
I like what people have said about evidence-based policy making, but what I'd like to do in some sense is be able to have that when the FCC's rationale for a policy is not because it looks like an antitrust violation. Not everything that's bad that happens is one. Whenever, we've heard before this mantra of competition, competition, competition. As I've said before, whenever I've heard the chairman say that, all I think of is antitrust division, antitrust division, antitrust division. If that, in fact, is what the FCC is there to do, why have it? It's got a public interest standard, and every so often, maybe they shouldn't do very much. Maybe something comes up where, in fact, that's the rationale. But if it is, there should be some sort of evidence-based way of talking about that rationale, and my concern is that there isn't one, and I don't know how to get one.
I mean, I don't know the answer to that question. I'm not sure that just sort of a re-institutionalizing the FCC, I mean, trying to create a new institution will work necessarily, because there's some underlying process that's caused the FCC to operate the way it does. And until we deal with that issue, we're just going to build up something that operates exactly the same way. What exactly is that issue, and why is it different at the FCC than in others? I'm honestly not sure, and it's not. I don't think it's just independence, because I don't think we would say that the FTC, which is independent, is inherently better than the DOJ. Some things it is, some things it isn't. I'm not sure. The DOJ is part of the executive branch, of course, so that's not it by itself. But I don't have a good answer. I do know, though, that I agree with what Mark said about, and actually on the last panel, and others have said about, all of the great people who work at the FCC, and that there is a lot of really good analysis there, and that the skills are all there to do a really, really good job. And it is sort of all the politics and the public pressures that sort of get in the way of making those things happen. But I don't know how to, what it is about those pressures that have caused the FCC to operate the way it does today, and so therefore how you fix it. I also want to address Tim's point about the public interest standards, and I think also that's an important point, even to the extent when we talk about wanting cost-benefit analysis, which of course as an economist I do. But some things that the FCC does, if it's a public interest standard, we've just decided as a society we want these things, right? If we want everybody to be connected to the network. The sort of the network externalities, the example that people use as an economic justification for that really just isn't true for various reasons. So the net benefits of connecting everybody are probably, the net economic benefits are probably going to be less than zero. But we want to do it. It's just a societal goal. So then once we've decided that, then you have to have some criteria for making the decision how. And then instead of cost-benefit analysis, then you can encourage something like cost-effectiveness analysis. So I'm not sure you have to completely, you can still use economic techniques. There's not necessarily the standard ones that we used before.
Yeah, I just want to add that probably being transparent is one of the great things to be done. And actually the FCC is moving in this direction. So recently, there's a lot of data collection, there are pilot programs, and the data have been released to researchers, so academics just like me, Scott, and others, we can look at the data, and if the FCC doesn't do anything with that, at least we can maybe show what's going on. So, but I agree, I think it's a very hard question.
All right, for Bill and Michael, I want you to drill down on an issue that Michael addressed more directly, which is how do you get the physical side, what he referred to as the physical side, to invest more in digital technology?
Yep.
Capital?
Information technology, software. It's actually astounding how far the physical industries have lagged behind the digital industries in terms of investment. But I think this I don't know whether Bill, I think he and I would sort of basically say the same thing at this point from different perspectives. I would say that part of what's held back the physical industries is it just turns out to be harder to apply digital technology to physical processes, and that we're just developing now the technology in terms of big data, in terms of small low-cost sensors, in terms of ubiquitous mobile networks that enable us to actually use information technology to help accelerate productivity growth in the physical industries. And partly we need to sort of have a regulatory apparatus that is open to this, because what happens is that if you make people jump through hoops, then the process of introducing these things slows down. And if the process slows down, you don't get the productivity gains at the rate that people want.
I would agree with a lot of that. I think that, as I said, we're trying to get this technology adopted, and the way it'll get adopted will be in very different situations. A lot of the broadband we're putting out there right now is being driven because people are watching movies. And we can decide societally that's a good thing. But all this other stuff is because we want to have people to add these sensors in their factories, changing their businesses. And how those decisions get made, it's going to be a blend between a service business and an equipment business. So a lot of cases, people are going about and want to buy stuff and say, if I hook up this stuff, I want to make sure I can hook it up easily. New types of people allowing them to do that, like put cameras up to do something in my business, whatever it is. I want these things to talk to each other. A lot of that's going to be wireless, and we do not want to have, for example, in the spectrum policy space, a wireless regime that has decided what the right business model is. Or it's a service provider model, it's an unlicensed model, it's equipment. It needs to be all of those, and we need to be able to change and adapt as the market adapts. Because the spectrum, the way it'll get used in local small areas with these sensors, you're going to have much more substitutability amongst different types of technologies and platforms. So we want to make sure the basic access to the raw commodity, the RF, is able so that when people innovate and have these cool new boxes, there's a way that they can actually be developed in the marketplace. We're going to need a lot better data, and because a lot of this stuff, to make it work and actually hook up together, it's going to have to be self-configuring. To make it self-configuring and to feed into this sort of evidence-based decision-making, which is really important, we have to actually have infrastructure that's going to do the measurements that people want. Right now, people are all focused on, I want to know how fast my broadband is. That's part of what you care about broadband, but it's not all you care about. What you really care about is, how do my applications run when I need them? And the answer you want to that question depends on how you're asking it. If you look at any other consumer good, we have consumer reports, we have some government reporting and collecting of statutes, and we have third-party analysts. So we need to make sure all of that stuff works. In this Internet of Things world, the devices are going to be making decisions on your behalf, talking to other devices. They need to be able to make those decisions. There are huge policy analysis decisions about what happens when computer programs are deciding how to self-regulate. That's a big research question in law schools, in economics departments, and in engineering systems design. In my lab, I sit in the computer science artificial intelligence lab at MIT. They were asking questions, like autonomous vehicle. It's driving, it's my autonomous vehicle, someone's crossing the street, and the only alternative is I crash into a wall and kill myself, or I kill the pedestrian. What do I want my autonomous vehicle to do when it makes that decision on my behalf? Now, that's not an easy question to ask, and how you ask it technically is going to affect how people are going to feel about it and all this. And these are, the need to compress these is really important. So I think that we know from the very first panel that we don't have good data and the problems are getting worse. We need to try and fix that. That is definitely something in the Economics Academy that's a problem. But we need to build in the ability to measure, to have the access to the resources and the process institutionally, so that we can have these dialogues knowing that we are going into a bold future where we're going to have to react, where we won't have all the evidence, and we need to understand how to quickly identify problems and respond. And the best place to see that is look at what's going on in security economics.
And one more thing here, which is getting to the macro level, we need better tax policy. I mean, I hate to say this, but we're sort of talking about massive amounts of investment, not just in the networks, but also massive amounts by the industrial users of the networks, and this has to be done in a way that is tax efficient. And I think that when we talk about sort of a lack of investment, we're sort of talking about a lack of investment in a lot of the physical industries, and there's reasons for that.
Okay. Hillary Clinton has probably the biggest digital infrastructure proposal on the table, which is to basically make broadband universally available by 2020. I think that's a fair way of describing it. Take 20 to 30 seconds, each of you, and say whether that is a smart or dumb idea, and how would you tweak it, how would you implement it, whatever you want to address about it.
I agree with Jerry Fallheimer's point that all is focused on wiring up every home. I think it's really important, but we ought to think about what's the infrastructure we need. And right now, we're building that infrastructure for television. We want to ask, what is the infrastructure we need to build for all this other stuff?
The basic idea that we should have it all over the place is probably not a great idea. There was no cost-benefit analysis to that. The good part of what she has to say is that she would look for where are there barriers to competition. I think that's a good idea. The main concerns I have about the basic policies, other than just why are you doing that, is that a lot of it is very subjective. We will give money to these kinds of people, maybe in these kinds of situations. And that just opens the door for a lot of shenanigans to go on.
When you were first talking about her IT infrastructure, I thought you were referring to her home server. I think, sort of one issue with this, I guess, is how big. I mean, in the sense of, the rationale for everybody having to have 25 megabytes is so you have 4 different HDTV video streams going on into a house at the same time. I mean, so in terms of the cost, here's the cost-benefit analysis part of it. I think that's important. And one thing that occurred to me when Howard was talking earlier, that perhaps you might get a little more deployment if people who are doing the deploying might have the ability to charge content providers for delivery, which right now is prohibited. So maybe that should be lifted.
So first, I mean, it's important, I think, just to point out that she did release a plan. And so, when we talk about it, she released a plan so we have something to criticize, which is obviously in comparison to some unnamed, narcissistic, bigoted. But having said that, The 100% goal really isn't realistic. We never got to 100% wireline penetration. Wireline telephone penetration. So it's not going to happen. And then second, how do you define it? If you include satellite, we do have 100% penetration already, right? Not adoption, but it's availability. And the real question is, what is it that people what's the demand really for? What are people going to do with it? What are they willing? When I say willing to pay, I mean what is the underlying demand for it? And not decide in advance what the answer to that question is.
I'm going to echo Bill here and say that I have nothing in theory against the goal of increasing consumer penetration of broadband, but in terms of actually increasing consumer welfare and living standards, that we'd be better off figuring out what infrastructure is actually going to help the 80% of the economy that is not yet truly digitized, and getting to the point where we have rising productivity growth in the physical industries as well. We've had food prices that are actually have been going up a lot more than the CPI, and have had a bigger impact on consumer welfare at the bottom end than anything else that could be going on in consumer broadband, I think. And so we should think about a broader measure than simply the consumer broadband. We have to think about what infrastructure we need.
Well, just based on the lessons that we learned from the universal service for wireline, I think it will be extremely hard, and also recent studies in the Lifeline for broadband also showed how hard it is to sign up consumers who are not willing to sign up for the broadband, and we still don't know what are the factors and what makes the program successful. So I haven't seen the plan, but good luck.
All right, why don't we open it up for questions from you all? Right, it's coming very soon.
There's plenty up here.
That's why you don't have any back there where you have a study device.
I'd like to kind of address this last point, and generally broadband/universal service. There was a study done by at least one person on the FCC that was put out about 1.5 years ago that kind of keyed off this point I made earlier, that our broadband household penetration, wired, is in the order of 70%. What this study did was to look at what we call non-adopters. And they looked at why don't people adopt broadband? Is it because it's too expensive? Is it because they're stupid? Is it because they don't agree with us? What is it? They found when questioning that over 70% of the people that were non-adopters said that they would not adopt broadband even if the price were zero. Now, those of us who are tech freaks think, my God, they should adopt it, right? And it's like other people would like me to insist on eating broccoli, but I don't want to, okay? And the issue is, why are we forcing this on people? Why do we think this is a good idea? Why don't we let people make choices? And if anybody would like to comment on that, and particularly on that study that was done, I'd like to hear it.
Well, I'll just say something that, yeah, I agree with that. And also, consistent with that study, the pilot programs had exactly the same result. Just people, even at the price of a few bucks a month, most people who didn't already have it weren't willing to subscribe. So that's just played out in reality, in the real world, in addition to what people respond to service. So.
Can I actually take the counter argument here, which is that if I'm a government and I actually want to sort of go digital in some of my services, the fact that a substantial portion of my population does not have broadband access makes it much harder for me to do that, and so imposes a larger cost on society. So there's actually an argument to make sure that even if there's a barrier to people learning at the beginning, that if we can get to a certain degree of penetration, that on the government side we can sort of take a lot of those piles of paper and make the access digital. So I would actually, think carefully about saying this is all about personal choice, because there's civic obligations as well, which are actually quite costly.
I disagree with that, because we actually went that direction in Florida. The government digitized, in part to prompt people to become digitized themselves. And a lot did, and a lot did not. But still, if you want to apply for anything in Florida with the government, you have to go to a computer to do it. And we have computers set up around for people to do that. They don't have to have it in their home. A lot did not want to.
I would say, if I had my druthers, I would take the Universal Service Program, and I would basically figure out how to shrink it as much as possible, and then say, who do I still have a problem with? And if I thought a problem, I would say, make sure the anchor institutions have the right infrastructure they need, because if they do, then there's a lot of wireless options for solving the rest of the problems. So that would be priority one. And then, then figure out what the subsidies are. In many cases, the problem, Ellie Noem once said, he said, the problem with the internet, this was back in 1998, he said, the problem with the internet is not that people don't have internet, it's that they're poor. And that, if you can solve them not being poor, then they'll probably get internet, and you will solve that problem. And the internet's probably not the most important thing to solving their problem about being poor.
Anybody else? Next.
Richard Bennett, High Tech Forum. So, Mike, I want to ask you about your analysis of physical industries not adopting technology. As far as I know, the two biggest physical industries are agriculture and manufacturing. And I don't think you can make an argument that those industries are not adopting information technologies.
If you look at the data for manufacturing in particular, what you see is that their stock of information technology assets, both software and physical, once you take out computer and electronic manufacturing, is basically flat since 2000. And so this is reading right off of the BEA data. This was a surprise to me as well. And it goes along with the fact that most manufacturing industries have had negative multi-factor productivity growth over the last 10 years. In some sense, I kind of actually regard this fact, okay, which is a lack of productivity growth and the lack of information technology investment, as being one of the prime sources of our competitive problems internationally. Because frankly, we can't compete against low-wage countries if we're not investing in IT and if we don't have productivity growth. So I'd be happy to sort of show you the data on this. This is actually as good as, I was actually surprised to find out that the census was doing direct surveys of information technology spending by industries. I came upon this, and like I said, I didn't know they were doing this, but they're actually out there. This is as good a data as we can get about what's being spent. And just as another fill, if you sort of look at spending on robots, it's a teeny-weeny fraction of what these industries are spending overall. So yeah, this is both a surprise and a problem.
Can I just add to that? I mean, this is the other side of the productivity puzzle, right? That some of it's measurement issues that we discussed in the last panel, and the other is people say that these, I don't know what you want to call them, more traditional physical, I guess the physical sector hasn't invested enough or hasn't properly figured out how to use the new technologies, right? And that we should, hopefully, and the optimistic view is that they will, and we'll figure it out, and we'll increase productivity again. But that's the question, right?
That's right.
I just have a quick remark. Not only is the census doing this, the McKinsey Global Institute had a report last year. This is absolutely the same finding, by the way. So you can triangulate if you like. And it's the same finding. There's a sort of a whole set of industries who whole hog into digital technologies and a whole set of sub-markets where it's not. And I was also extraordinarily surprised by it. I just thought there'd be late adopters by this point. No, it's actually non-adoption across a whole range of activity.
And if you go and you ask people in manufacturers what is actually going on in their factories, with the exception of the auto industry, okay, which is actually moving on, and they will whisper to you what's going on that is not happening.
I'll just make one quick point that, when it happens, the effects are really huge. So just look at Uber and Airbnb and what they've been able to do to the industries that they've come into. And, so I think thinking when this happens, it will happen really quickly, and understanding what the policy responses would be, because it's not clear exactly what the longer-term policy response ought to be to Uber and Airbnb, and is this ultimately good for our economy? In the near term, there's obviously a huge amount of consumer benefit for the consumers that are taking advantage of those services.
Why are all these businesses leaving $20 bills on the sidewalk?
Well, here's a question. So that's the question you have to ask. And the way that I think about this is that if you sort of look at the data requirements of digitizing physical production processes, for example, GE's talks about how much they sort of put sensors on their aircraft engines, and they just generate an enormous amount of information each minute. And so I think that we didn't have either the wireless infrastructure or the capabilities of handling this data in real time that we actually need to do it. So I don't think there's so much leaving it on the sidewalk, is that they didn't have a long enough arm to reach it yet.
George.
I think if you look across the manufacturing industries in the U.S., and you actually look at the multi-factor productivity, what you see is an appalling picture. There's one industry that has real growth, which is computers and electronics, and the rest of them range from almost no growth to negative growth, including industries like machinery that you would actually expect to be early adopters here. It's basically, they're not investing in information technology, they're not getting the benefits of their investment, they're not, and so it all kind of fits together in a picture, like Bill says, that can actually transform very quickly. So in the medium-term sense, I'm actually very optimistic about productivity growth, but it's going to, and also competitiveness, but it's going to be a transformation. George?
George Ford, Phoenix Center. It's not a new problem that when I was at the FCC back in 94, I guess early 95, we had a meeting on the 8th floor. All the economists were called in. We just hired a bunch of new economists. And we were told explicitly that the role of the economists was to justify the means to the ends that were chosen by the higher-ups. And you can imagine that I was the first to stand up and protest. The puzzle here for me is that we have sort of the right end of the table complaining, or at least stage left, complaining about the agency and the quality of regulation. And then we have Bill at the other end talking about all these coordination problems and the need to allocate and assign spectrum and all these various problems that somebody's got to do. And I don't know if there's some policy to get the manufacturing sector to do more broadband, but we have the need for some policy and the incompetent policymaker. What do we do?
I was actually surprised to hear Mark say that we should get rid of the FCC. I think we absolutely need, and maybe that's probably an overcharacterization. I definitely think we need to think about it. I think we absolutely need an independent regulatory agency. The ideal version of it would be a Maytag repairman, those old commercials. He has to be tooled up so he can intervene if he needs to in the right way, but probably, hopefully, does very little, actually. He's got a role in terms of curating data and jawboning and getting the industry and threatening people to do the right thing. And he has a whole bunch of residual stuff that he has to do, even though he doesn't want to. So he still has to be sort of dealing with all that stuff. So I think we definitely need that, but we also need to beef up other things. And so industry self-regulation efforts in this area I think are really important. Standardization is critically important, and that was what Howard Shalansky was talking about, antitrust policy earlier, and thinking about that. Now, that doesn't mean that standards bodies get a free on antitrust, because they can be vehicles for that, but they really need to we need to promote that, because these industries totally depend on interoperability and standards.
Let me actually bring a little bit of a global perspective here. In Europe, they're trying to sort of do this top-down, and it's turning out to be a disaster. I went to a dinner in Brussels, where this was after a conference on digital manufacturing, where in order, a government official would get up and say, we're going to help you, and then the next thing, the business official would get up and say, please don't, okay? And I think that we're sort of finding out that countries like Germany, which actually have a manufacturing base and the capability of doing this if they want to, are choosing not to because of internal institutional reasons. So what we have to do is we have to figure out how to get around our own institutional roadblocks to take advantage of the technologies that are coming right now that have the ability to propel productivity forward. Who is we? The people in this room. Okay, I'm going to put him in charge.
No, please don't.
Well, I'm with Scott Wallsten. If the election goes the wrong way, then the only people who will actually build a wall will be the Canadians.
Right?
Larry, you have a question?
Larry Downs again. So this came up, I think, in the earlier panel about the fact that because we don't measure digital trade, it doesn't become a priority in terms of trade negotiations. Several people on the panel probably can address this. So, you know, Google's been saying for years that we're involved in a digital trade war, particularly with the Europeans. That's become increasingly clear as they've implemented the so-called digital single market. What would be your policy recommendations to the next administration regarding digital trade across borders?
Well, I think that if you think about global governance, as I was talking about, so we have internet governance, we've got spectrum harmonization. Spectrum harmonization with the ITU usually means, oh, let's not do anything today, let's not talk about any of these new technologies because we have to discuss it. So you know, too often the bodies we have are really inadequate. But to say having no bodies, that's not a good solution. So we definitely have to maintain a capability to have a seat at the table and understand that we can't run the world. So this nonsense that came up about, oh, the U.S. is giving up the internet is just a grotesque misunderstanding of that issue. But you know, definitely the internet, the U.S. State Department has to think about this. And we're going to have issues of like how to figure out in these things, how are you going to do this? It's part of its standards. Part of it is figuring out what these bodies are. Part of it is making sure the industry self-regulation bodies are strong enough to represent their interests.
And basically the ability to sort of talk about what the benefits of cross-border trade is, data flows, okay, in a real sense that people understand, becomes part of the trade process. I don't know if there's anything that can be done to sort of help TTIP at this point, but I think that the Europeans are proceeding along a course which is actually much more dangerous to them than it is to us.
This is Sarah Tyree. I'm with CoBank, and I have a question in reference specifically to those high-cost rural areas where there's basically a market failure. It doesn't pencil to build out broadband, and so a lot of the, you know, farmers, rural communities, they don't have access to it, not even access to where they can turn down anything like Lifeline. And so what do you all think is the appropriate policy for this type of market failure area?
Let me just say first that when you're in a room full of economists and you say that market failure, that's not a market failure to economists. I mean, it may be a policy failure of some sort. And that was sort of why I started off by saying that we need, if we think that somehow it's important to provide this when the market isn't doing it, and there's no apparent market failure in the economist sense of there being some sort of externality or something, that then one needs some way of being able to say, you know, how much is enough, how much is too much, and that's what I'm afraid we don't have. And I don't know. I mean, that's something that takes a body of decision makings to establish precedents and so on, which is why I say I don't really know how to come up with a process that says, okay, this is how we know that this is exactly how big a subsidy we need, and because this has so much social importance, it's worth X dollars and that sort of stuff. I mean, I give sort of semi-glib things, you know, how much are people willing to pay for a more equal society or something along those lines, but I'm not sure that's really the right ethical answer either. So, so I'll leave the specifics on that to the others, but just to say that if you say market failure and people kind of, if economists sort of stare back saying what, that's sort of what's going on.
Yeah, I agree with what Tim said. That a market does something I don't like doesn't mean it failed. It just means the market and I disagree. I think the idea that John had earlier about what do we really mean by people having the services is a good one. I think we need to investigate that. what that really means. That I do think that some of the work that has been going on at the FCC recently about how do we use competition to get the most efficient person doing something that needs to be subsidized, and how much does that subsidy really need to be. Scott's done some very good work in that area. And frankly, that's an area where we're about 15 years behind the rest of the world. That's been going on elsewhere for a long time. We're just finally catching up.
I think that the policy of net neutrality might play a role here, and I actually would be really interested to see what are the impact of net neutrality on those high cost and rural areas, because so I was, my colleague and I, we are thinking of estimating the impact of net neutrality if the data permits, and we were looking at rural areas, and turns out that in areas where there's just one carrier, which has, say, outdated wireline technology, such as DSL, which doesn't allow high-speed internet connection, they sort of abandon it and they start to provide wireless service, which is much more expensive for consumers because it has a data gap. So I think that this policy might have a long-term impact on the investment and development of broadband in those high-cost rural areas.
We just sort of add to that and say that if Google, Facebook, and Amazon would really like the stuff deployed out there so they could reach more customers, why don't we have Google, Facebook, and Amazon chip in and pay some of the cost for that? But unfortunately, we have an open internet order that prohibits that.
I'd agree with all those comments. I also would say that, I wish parking were cheap in Boston, and I'm sorry that broadband is, So, I mean, that's part of the policy question. The other thing is there are a lot of, the nature of what's happening in terms of wireless solutions for if communities are allowed to self-provision. So if you've got out barriers to communities wanting to do things in municipal networking. Not to say most communities should do municipal networks, because in most cases, they're not going to do as good a job as the telecom providers. But if they have that option, there's a lot of really cheap gear that isn't going to necessarily be the right solution for 20 years, but it can damn well do a great job in the short term. Ubiquity's got antennas now that are almost self-configuring, dirt cheap, and it'll give you can do a cross-link with Wi-Fi that'll work easily up to a mile and better. And that stuff comes right out of the box, and it's not, you kind of need to be a little bit geeky, but only a little bit geeky. And if you think about it, that's what Wi-Fi you can only start buying that stuff in big box stores around 2002. And then by 2008, everybody has Wi-Fi and it all totally works. And so I think we are that potential and be able to offer broadband in these places. You need to have the middle mile access. Like we've done this in Massachusetts. We built it out, but nobody's on the fiber because we haven't figured out how to get the towns online. But that's a problem that I think can get solved relatively quickly.
That question seems to have carried us across the finish line. Is that right? Yep. Okay. It is 12:45, and so thank you very much for great questions.
I know everybody's starving. John Mayo's just going to make a few introductory remarks, and if he goes beyond sort of a certain amount of time, I'll make him stop.
I promise not to make introductory remarks. So I thought today was a perfect opportunity, a perfect time to have the conversation we're having. The election is 6 weeks away. I was going to say agendas haven't been set. They probably have been set, but they're more malleable now than they will ever be. No matter which party winds up being elected as president, and the administration now has some ears that wouldn't happen otherwise. The people in this room this morning, we had 16 economists in the room. These are people that have spent collectively dozens and dozens of years studying the digital infrastructure and what might make it work better and what policies might stand in the way of it working better for the administration. Both Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump talk a lot about infrastructure. I think the people to speak to them was in this room today. We could only start the conversation today. So I hope it will continue. I want to thank all of the economists that were here today. And I also want to say in Washington, thank you to the people that were here other than the panelists. In Washington, we always seem to have tremendous experts in the room that could be on the dais at any given time. So thank you for being here. Look forward to other conversations. Thanks for coming.